The night was thick with the scent of salt and impending doom. In our small coastal village, the air usually hummed with a gentle lullaby of waves, but tonight, the ocean roared like a wounded beast. Torches flickered wildly in the hands of angry men and women who circled a young woman named Ebony. Their shadows danced like demons against the wet sand. The tide was rising with terrifying speed, sweeping past the usual markers and swallowing the shoreline. "He has cursed us," a voice screamed over the wind. Fingers pointed toward the dark horizon, then back at the man kneeling in the surf. It was Kola, Ebony's husband, the one-eyed fisherman. The villagers believed his presence had finally insulted the ancient spirits of the deep. Just as the mob prepared to lung, a massive, towering wave reared up, glowing with an eerie green light. It crashed downward with the force of falling mountain, yet stopped perfectly, inches from Kola's bare feet. Kola sat motionless as the seawater swirled around his knees, refusing to touch his skin. The villagers dragged him upward, his tattered clothes dripping with spray. He was a man of few words, his face partially hidden by a rough cloth that covered his left socket. To the people of this village, that missing eye was a mark of shame, a sign that he was broken or perhaps even demonic. They mocked him to market and whispered that he brought bad luck to any boat he touched. Now, their mockery had turned into a cold, sharp hunger for vengeance. The crowd pressed in, their faces twisted by the orange glow of the torches. "The fish have fled, and the salt has turned bitter in our mouths," the village elder declared, his voice trembling with a mixture of age and manufactured rage. He raised a gnarled wooden staff toward the churning black sky. "The sea is angry because of the rot among us. It demands a sacrifice." Ebony did not hesitate. While the other women shrank back into the shadows of the palms, she stepped forward into the drenching spray. She placed her body directly between her husband and the advancing mob, her eyes flashing with fire that rivaled the torches. "You call him rot, yet he is the only one among you who never takes more than he needs," she cried out. The villagers gasped, shocked by her boldness. To them, Ebony had always been a mystery, a woman of grace and beauty who had inexplicably chosen a scarred pauper over the wealthy merchants who had courted her. They muttered that she was bewitched, or perhaps just as cursed as he was. Ebony felt Kola's hand brush against her ankle, a silent plea for her to step away and save herself. She only gripped her wrapper tighter and stood her ground. As she did, the sea let out a low, guttural growl that shook the very earth beneath their feet. To understand how Ebony came to stand in the surf that night, we must look back many years. It began on a day when the sun hung heavy and golden over the coast. Ebony had been walking along the edge of the forgotten cliffs, far from the bustling main harbor where the successful men displayed their silver scale catches. There, she found a man sitting alone, meticulously repairing a net that seemed more holes than string. It was Kola. The other youths were in the village square, boasting of their strength, but Kola worked in a silence that felt like a prayer. When he looked up, Ebony did not flinch at the jagged scar that ran down his cheek. He looked at her with his one good eye, an eye the color of deep mahogany, and spoke in a voice like shifting sand. "The sun is retreating. Daughter of the soil," he warned softly. "You must not stay here after the light dies." Ebony did not listen to the warning. Instead, she sat on a nearby rock, watching his calloused fingers move with the precision of a weaver. For weeks after that, she returned to the cliffs. She saw how the village suitors would pass by and spit toward Kola, calling him half-sight or spirit bait. They offered Ebony gold trinkets and promises of houses made of stone, but their words fell hollow like empty conch shells. In Kola, she found a gentleness that the world had tried to beat out of him. He told her stories of the tides and the language of the gulls, speaking of the ocean as if it were a living, breathing mother. One evening, as the moon began to silver the waves, Kola turned to her with a heavy expression. The air grew cold between them. "Ebony, you see a man where others see a monster," he whispered. "But the sea has many faces. Tell me, can you truly live with secrets?" Despite the warnings of her parents and the laughter of her peers, Ebony gave her hand to the one-eyed fisherman. Their wedding day was a somber affair that felt more like a funeral. No drums echoed to the village, and no dancers wore their bright beads for them. The village priest refused to offer a blessing, claiming that a union with a marked man would only invite the shadows indoors. They walked to their small, thatched hut on the edge of the dunes alone, carrying only a single mat and a cooking pot. Ebony's father had turned his back, ashamed that his beautiful daughter had chosen a life of poverty and scars. Yet, as they crossed the threshold of their humble home, something strange occurred. The wind, which had been howling all morning, suddenly dropped to a whisper. The sea, usually restless and loud, became so unnaturally calm that it looked like a sheet of black glass reflecting the stars. Months passed, and the curse of the villagers expected never arrived. In fact, the opposite began to happen. While the great boats of the wealthy merchants returned with half-empty hulls, Cola's small, battered canoe was always overflowing. He would go out into the mist and return within hours, his nets heavy with the finest snapper and mackerel the village had seen in generations. When the great dust storm ruined the inland crops, the gardens around Ebony and Cola's hut remained lush and green, as if the dew itself favored their soil. Prosperity followed them like a loyal dog, and they shared their bounty with the widows and the orphan children. But in a village built on pride, such blessings only served to fuel the fires of envy. The people began to watch them from behind closed shutters. They wondered how a man with one eye could see fish that the best divers missed. Suspicion began to grow like mold. Among those who watched was Efua, a woman who had been Ebony's closest friend since childhood. Efua had married a rich trader, yet she found no joy in her silk wrappers because she could not stand to see Ebony happy with a lesser man. She would visit Ebony's hut, bringing gifts of palm wine while asking probing, honey-coated questions. "How does Cola find such fish in the dead of night?" she would ask, leaning in close. "Is it true he carries a charm made of human bone?" Ebony would only smile and say that Cola worked harder than the rest. This answer did not satisfy Efua's bitter heart. One moonless night, driven by a dark curiosity, Efua wrapped herself in a charcoal shawl and followed Cola down to the water's edge. She hid behind a cluster of jagged rocks, her breath coming in short, nervous gasps. She watched as Cola stood at the prow of his boat, looking not at the water, but at the sky. As Efua watched Cola from the shadows, the village elder, a man named Osei, was busy weaving his own net of lies. Osei was a man who loved power more than he loved the truth. He had grown rich by taking credit for the village's safety for 40 years, telling stories of how his prayers kept the sea monsters away. He sensed the shifting moods of the people and knew that a common enemy would keep them under his thumb. He gathered the men in the village square beneath the ancient baobab tree. "The sea does not give without taking," he told them, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "There's an old legend that the sea marks its chosen ones. Sometimes that mark is a stolen eye." He looked around at the fearful faces of the fishermen. "Cola prospers while you hunger. Do you not see the imbalance?" His eyes lingered toward the dunes where Cola's hut sat in the distance. While the village plotted, Cola was fighting a battle within his own mind. He began to have dreams that left him drenched in a cold sweat. In these visions, he was no longer a man of 30, but a boy of 12. He saw himself standing on the pier during the great flood that had almost erased the village decades ago. He remembered the sound of the water screaming and the sight of children being swept away. In the dream, a younger version of himself stood before a shimmering, faceless presence rising from the surf. There was a bargain made in the darkness, a life for a life, a sight for a soul. He felt the sharp, cold sting of the salt entering his wound, the price of the village's salvation bleeding out of him. He would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming in a language that Ebony did not recognize, his hand clutching cloth that covered his missing eye as if the pain were fresh. Ebony felt the weight of her husband's silence growing heavier each day. She could sense a wall rising between them, built of secrets he was too afraid to voice. She would watch him at the breakfast table, his hand trembling as he reached for a piece of roasted yam. "Cola, tell me what haunts you," she would plead, her voice soft with love. "The sea has given us much, but it seems to be taking your peace in return." Cola would only shake his head and look toward the horizon. "There are debts that words cannot pay, Ebony," he would reply. The tension in the village was also reaching a breaking point. One evening, while walking to the well, Ebony heard a low, rhythmic chanting coming from the shore. It wasn't the usual song of the fisherman. It sounded like a summons. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine, a premonition that the peace they had built was about to be shattered. Effia did not keep what she saw secret. She went straight to Elder Ose and told him that she had seen Kola talking to the waves. He sings to the water, and the water obeys him, she lied, adding salt to her tale to make it more treacherous. The elder smiled, knowing this was a spark he needed to light the fire. Together, they began to spread the word that Kola was a thief of luck, stealing the prosperity that rightfully belonged to the whole village. He has made a pact with the dark tide, they whispered in the market. Every fish in his net is a curse on your children's future. They convinced the villagers that the only way to restore the natural order was to put Kola through a trial of the deep. They planned to seize him and force him to reveal the source of his power, or let the sea take him back. Betrayal hung in the air like the smell of rotting kelp. The escalation happened at dawn. Abney was still asleep when a group of men, led by Ose and a jealous rival suitor, burst into their hut. They didn't speak. They simply grabbed Kola by the arms and dragged him out into the cold morning air. Abney woke to the sound of her husband's grunt as he was thrown to the ground. She ran outside, her hair disheveled and her heart pounding, but she was pushed back by the villagers who had gathered to watch. "Stay back, woman. This is for the good of the people," they shouted. They bound Kola's hands with thick, salty rope and led him toward the great pier. The sky, which had been clear moments before, suddenly turned a bruised purple. The sea began to darken, changing from a deep blue to a murky, charcoal gray. The waves didn't just crash. They seemed to boil. Abney tried to reach him, but she was too late. He was already being taken. As the men dragged Kola toward the water, Abney ran to the village, searching for someone, anyone, who would help. She stumbled upon a small, derelict hut on the very edge of the woods. There lived an old woman whom everyone ignored, a woman so old she seemed to be made of driftwood and memories. The old woman took Abney's hands in her own, her grip surprisingly strong. "You seek the truth of the one-eyed man," she wheezed. "Listen well, child, memory is a fickle thing. 40 years ago, the sea rose to swallow us all. The elders today tell you it was their prayers that saved us, but the sea does not listen to the greedy." The old woman leaned in close, her eyes milky with age. She told Abney that a sacrifice had been demanded back then to stop the great flood. The village was saved because a young boy stepped forward when the men were hiding in the hills. It was not the elder who paid. The truth hit Abney like a physical blow. The marked man the village hated was the very person who had saved them when they were children. The old woman explained that Kola, as a young boy, had offered his eye to the sea spirit to appease its hunger and turn back the flood. He had lived in silence for decades, watching the elder Ose take the credit and the glory. Kola had chosen to be mocked rather than to boast of his sacrifice. "He gave his sight so they could have a future," the woman whispered. But the debt was never truly repaid by the people. They gave him hatred instead of honor, and the sea has a long memory for such ingratitude. Abney realized that the prosperity Kola had been receiving wasn't a curse. It was the sea finally trying to give back what was owed to its guardian. But the villagers' greed had turned that gift into a weapon against him. Abney raced back to the shore, her lungs burning. By the time she arrived, the scene had turned supernatural. The waves were now 30 feet high, standing like frozen walls of glass. The boats in the harbor were being tossed around like toys, their wooden hulls shattering against the rocks. The air was filled with sound like 1,000 voices whispering at once, and through the roar of the wind, specific names began to echo. "Ose! Effia! Ose!" The water seemed to be calling the names of those who had harbored the most malice. The villagers were screaming now, realizing that the trial had gone horribly wrong. They were no longer the judges. They were the accused. The sea was rising in a magnificent, terrifying judgment. Kola remained kneeling on the sand, his head bowed, while the water circled him with a strange, protective reverence. The missing eye beneath the cloth began to throb with a faint, rhythmic light. The terror of the villagers was absolute. They tried to flee, but the wet sand seemed to pull at their feet, keeping them trapped on the shoreline. Abney saw the elder Osei trembling, his staff broken in two. Seeing the chaos, Abney realized that the sea wouldn't stop until a new balance was found. She didn't think of her own safety. She ran past the screaming mob and walked into the freezing, rising water. She stood beside Kola and looked up at the towering waves. "If you take him, you take me," she screamed at the ocean. "He has already given you his sight. He has given this village his life. What more do you want?" She offered her hands to the waves, willing to give herself as a sacrifice if it meant Kola would be spared. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The wind died down to a sudden, chilling silence. The great walls of water hung suspended in the air. Kola slowly stood up. For the first time in their marriage, he reached up and pulled the cloth away from his face. Abney and the entire village stared in awe. Where there should have been a hollow, scarred socket, there was a sphere of pure, liquid moonlight. The missing eye was not gone. It had been transformed into a gem of the deep. It didn't look like a human eye. It looked like a portal into the very heart of the ocean. As the light from Kola's eye hit the water, the sea responded. The massive waves didn't crash. They bowed. They lowered themselves gently back into the basin of the shore, smoothing out like silk. The green glow from the eye illuminated the faces of every man and woman present, stripping away their masks of pretension. Kola stood tall, his presence suddenly majestic, no longer the hunched fisherman, but a prince of the tides. The sea acknowledged its master. The silence that followed was more uncomfortable than the storm. Under the light of Kola's glowing eye, the truth could no longer be hidden. The elder Osei fell to his knees, his face turning pale as his own memories of the great flood were projected onto the mist for everyone to see. The villagers saw the young Kola bleeding on the pier, while the elder hid in a wine cellar. They saw Efua's whispers turning into physical shadows of envy that crawled across the sand. The jealous friend broke down in tears, covering her face in shame as her lies were laid bare before the gods and the people. The purity of the village was revealed to be a lie, and the curse of the fishermen was revealed to be their only salvation. The sea demanded a balance for 40 years of stolen credit and decades of unearned hatred. Justice was no longer a concept. It was a rising tide. The punishment was not one of blood, but of poetic truth. As the sea receded, it took something with it. Elder Osei found that he could no longer speak. His voice, which he had used to weave so many lies, was gone, replaced by the sound of rushing water. He was stripped of his status and his memory, left to wander the shore as a man who knew nothing of his own name. Efua and the other conspirators found that their wealth, their gold and their fine silks, had turned into salt and wet sand. They were not killed, but they were made feel the same isolation and poverty they had forced upon Abney and Kola. The village learned that when you try to drown a good man, you only succeed in showing the world that he can breathe underwater. The balance was restored, but the cost of the wicked was their very identity. When the sun finally rose over a calm, shimmering ocean, the village looked different. The air felt lighter, cleansed of the heavy fog of suspicion. Kola's moon eyes slowly faded, returning to the appearance of a normal, closed scar, but the healing didn't stop there. The constant pain that had haunted his dreams vanished. His wound was not restored to a working eye, for the sea keeps what is given, but it was honored. Abney held him. Her heart overflowed with a relief that brought her to tears. The sea left one final gift on the shore, a path of rare, glowing pearls that led from the water's edge directly to their hut. These were not for wealth, but a sign of a lasting peace between the village and the deep. Kola looked at Abney with his one good eye, and for the first time, there were no secrets behind the mahogany. They were finally whole. The village was humbled beyond words. The people who had once spat toward the dunes now came with offerings of fruit and clean water, kneeling before the hut they had tried to burn. They did not come out of fear, but out of a deep, aching shame. The stories of the one-eyed ghost were discarded, replaced by songs of the guardian of the flood. The elders who remained vowed to teach the children the true history of their salvation. Songs were rewritten, and the village history was carved into the stone of the cliffs, so that no one would ever forget the price Kola had paid. Abney would walk through the market, and instead of whispers, she heard her name carried on the wind with respect. She had been the only one with the sight to see the hero behind the scar, and the village now looked to her as a beacon of loyalty. One evening, as the moon rose again, Kola stood at the edge of the water. The sea spirit whispered to him through the waves, offering him a place in the deep, a throne of coral and power where he would never be mocked again. He could have left the world of men behind and lived as a god of the tides. Ebony stood on the sand, watching him, her breath caught in her throat. She would not stop him if that was what his soul required. But Kola turned his back on the glowing depths. He walked back to the woman who had stood between him and the torches. He chose the warmth of a human heart over the cold majesty of the ocean. He chose the simple life of a fisherman over the crown of the sea. Dawn broke over a world where a man was finally loved for exactly who he was. Years turned into decades, and the story of the one-eyed fisherman became a legend that traveled far beyond our coastal village. Travelers would come from distant lands to see the man who had bargained with the sea. They found an old man with a peaceful face, and a woman whose beauty had only deepened with age. Children would sit at Kola's feet, and he would tell them that the most important things in life aren't seen with two eyes, but felt with one heart. The truth was no longer a secret. It was a foundation of the village's prosperity. When the storyteller pauses today, it is to remind us that every scar has a story, and every cursed man might just be the one holding the world together. The sea remained calm for as long as they lived, a silent witness to a love that had defied the storm. And so, my children, we come to the end of the tale of Ebony and her fisherman. It is a story that salt cannot wash away and time cannot bury. It teaches us that pride leads to a blindness far worse than any physical wound. The villagers had two eyes but were blind to the truth, while Kola had one eye and saw the destiny of 1,000 souls. Always remember that the sea and life itself does not reward the loudest voice or the most beautiful face. It rewards a loyal heart that stays when the torches are lit and the water is rising. When truth costs you your comfort and the world demands you turn away from what is right, would you still choose to stand? That is a question the waves ask every night. What lesson will you take back to your own hut tonight? Would you choose love, even if it meant standing alone? Would you like me to create an image of the glowing moon eye revealed at the sea's edge?